Hi there, and welcome to the What's Their Why podcast. In this first episode, I meet with Emma Darcy from the Chiltern Learning Trust. We discuss all manner of things, including motivation, engagement, EdTech conferences, and defending your own castle. Really hope you enjoy it as much as we did recording it. Welcome everyone to the first in a new series of podcasts under a new name now, the What's Their Why podcast, part of myedtechbuddy.co.uk. My name's Darren White, at Ranger the Trainer on Twitter, and I'm here really today to just share some ideas and some thoughts with some amazing guests. The first one of which we can already see on screen is a very, very well known and very well respected Emma Darcy. Good afternoon, Emma.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much.
How you doing? All right?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, really good. Really honoured to be your first guest.
It's really strange as well. First week back after Christmas, it's been a bit of a kind of thrown back in the deep end. I don't know about you, but everything's kind of gone back to back meetings and lots of excitement building, which is nice. After everyone was so tired towards the end of term, before Christmas, and people were just almost kind of dragging themselves to that finish line. It's nice to see people energized again, and hopefully we can contribute a bit to that as well. So thanks for joining us anyway.
No problem at all. Nice to be here.
For those people who don't know you, and there must be maybe a couple, you just give us a little bit of a background on yourself.
Sure. So, my name's Emma Darcy. I'm Director of Technology for Learning at Denby High School in Luton. I also work across the Chiltern Learning Trust, which is a multi-academy trust of 16 schools now in Luton and Central Bedfordshire. And I've been in this role for about 10 years now, and I can't believe how quickly it's gone actually. But no, it's a really interesting job because 2 days a week I'm at Denby. I'm on the senior leadership team here, and then on the other days I work across the other 15 schools in the trust, and it's supporting head teachers and leadership teams with digital strategy. It's supporting teachers in the classroom with pedagogy. It's working with students to understand what helps them to learn. So it's a really interesting, varied job. I feel very lucky.
Indeed. And how do you find that hybrid of working partly in school and then partly across the trust? How do you find that works?
I find it works really, really well now. In the early days, I had to, I think, kind of set up some expectations for myself because it's very easy when you've got one day in one school, one day in another, to kind of let everything blur into one another, to go home, to start doing a load of work in the evenings, that sort of thing. And one of the things I learned quite early on was that I really did need to make that distinction and say, okay, yes, so on these days I'm in Denby, I'm working for Denby, I'm fulfilling the role of a member of the senior leadership team, I'm doing the corridor cover, I'm doing all the other ad hoc stuff that comes in, but then on the other 3 days I am splitting that time across the other schools in the trust so that nobody feels sort of shortchanged and they're not getting that time.
I think that's a really important point as well, because it works both ways, doesn't it? You know, I did a similar thing last year myself, and I was working 2 days a week in school, teaching, and 3 days working for the trust. And it was also that aspect of making sure that you were providing what you needed to provide for the school when you were there, but also not leaving things to be done at another time, and then finding that actually other things on a trust perspective have got in the way, start maybe taking over, maybe taking a greater priority. And actually being fair to the school as well about these are the days that I'm working, and these are when you can expect me to do things specifically for you. And
these it is that, isn't it? It's managing the expectations so that everybody knows what to expect. But what I like about it as well is the fact that I can be involved in making a decision at a sort of strategic trust level, but I also then get to see on the ground in a school what impact that has. So I'm not just the person kind of saying, I think we should do this, this and this, and then walking away. I'm the person who then sees what impact that has on like teacher workload and on the students and everything else. And that I think is quite a privileged position to be in. I do quite like that. And it makes me rethink some of the things that I do some of the times as well.
I completely agree. And absolutely, I 100% advocate for the same thing. I think being a leader at the high level, you still need to be in and around the classroom, seeing what's going on, listening to those conversations, reading the room really, and knowing whether this is a good time to ask people to do something extra, or whether it's actually not a good time and next week might be better. And just those little things that you can lose sight of if you're not on the ground in the school, at least some of the time.
And I think it's understanding the pressures that schools are under at the moment as well, and actually seeing that firsthand and seeing what that. I mean, I know it's all wonderful and everything's fine, but no, I think being able to really sort of see what that translates into at ground level. I mean, I'm sure we'll talk later about things like teacher recruitment and stuff like that, but just seeing how that affects schools firsthand and being sensitive to some of those issues then in terms of like you say, the decisions you do make, the things that you do then ask people to do, thinking you're better equipped, I think, when you've got that whole context for it rather than just your one little strategic level bit.
Absolutely. So kind of leads me to my first question, really, which is, what got you here in the first place? What's your kind of educational background? What led you into education?
Well, I always end up saying to people at this point, at cards on the table, I'm not a teacher, Darren. And that's it. If you want to end the podcast at this point, I completely understand, because people always assume that, I must have a teaching background. I must have taught in schools. And I often think it's a bit of a disservice to claim that I have, because I haven't. But what I did do was I've always worked in education and sort of around schools. I worked in sort of further education for a number of years as like a college lecturer. And I ended up, the job that I did for the longest time before this was I worked for 10 years as manager of City Learning Centre. I don't know if you remember those, part of the Excellence in Cities programme. So we had one here in Luton. I was manager of that for 10 years.
In the city?
No, but the first phase of the programme, they only went to cities, and then in the second phase, they opened them in areas that were towns. So yes, so I ran a city learning centre in a town, which was why we called it e-learning at Luton, and we ran that centre for 10 years, and that was a fantastic opportunity because it was providing resources for schools at the time that they didn't have in their own environment, like ed tech resources. So we had to think, what would really benefit education if schools could access it, but that they can't afford to have? And so we would have schools from all different phases, key stages, come and visit us, come and use technology. My deputy manager was Christian Turton, who's now over at Sandringham School. So I worked with him for a number of years. And we had things like a Mac suite, we had a music technology suite, we had a television studio. And we had the luxury of, when new technology came out, we would go to the BET show, we would see things, we would bring it into that environment, and we would use it with students, and we would see the impact that it had. And over time, obviously, that technology, the good stuff, started to roll out into the schools, and the need for us as a centre didn't really exist anymore. And obviously the City Learning Centres programme was wound down anyway. I took voluntary redundancy, which was probably the most scary point in my life, because I thought, I have got no idea what I'm going to go on and do now. And it was a time when nobody was investing in technology for learning at all. And I thought, I genuinely have no idea what I'm going to go and do now. And that's the point where the role came up here at Denby. And that's where the head teacher and CEO of the trust, who was an amazingly forward-thinking lady called Dame Yasmin Bevan, she went, come and have a chat with me, because I think we need to be doing things in this school much better with technology, and I want to talk to you about it. And she said to me, she said, I've got fantastic network staff. She said, I have got amazing teachers. She said, I've spent a lot of money on technology over the years, but I am not seeing the impact in the classroom, and I'm not seeing the impact on the learners. And she said, I want someone to come in, develop a digital strategy for the school, and that's where we're going to start, Emma. And 10 years later, like I say, I'm still here, and it's kind of grown, and the trust has grown from like 3 schools at the time to like I say, 16, nearly 17. And we've introduced all kinds of crazy things like, one-to-one device schemes. We've tried lots of things out over the years, some of the things that work, some of the things that haven't. We've learned from lots of them. And and that's how I've ended up doing what I'm doing now.
And of course, that leads nicely onto, I mean, you mentioned BET, but you've been part of the advisory team for BET 23, haven't you?
Yes, yeah. This is my second year being on the BET advisory board, which has been really interesting actually, because I used to go to BET as obviously someone attending the show, and with all the good things and the bad things and everything else, and that was really interesting. It's been really interesting for the last 2 years to sort of see, not exactly behind the curtain, that makes it sound really mysterious, and it's not at all, but to sort of see what goes into planning and developing an event like that, and to be on the advisory board and have an input, even in like a small part, to an element of that. And like I say, it's an advisory board. You advise, you don't always influence and change things, but it's been really interesting to do that and to actually work alongside the other advisory board members and sort of play a little part in shaping what that event looks like over the last 2 years, particularly as we didn't have BET like the year before that. It was obviously it was a pandemic, we didn't have it at all, so it was back for the first time I think last year, and then obviously we've got the one this year as well.
Yeah, it's nice that it's moved that a little bit later in the year.
Yeah, I like that actually. The weather's a bit nicer, the days are a bit longer. Yeah, quite a few people have said that actually. It's it's a nice time of year to come along. You're not so close to Christmas. You've got like, you know, everyone knows that it's coming towards the end of the spring term. So yeah, I think the timing's good.
Yeah, and it must be really interesting as well to, you know, being part of that board, to see the different perspectives from outside of the education world as well, in terms of not just the event planning and organisation itself, but you know the perception of education and educational technology from outside. What's that like?
I think that you get an element of that on the advisory board. I mean, one of the things that, you know, we were talking about quite recently was the idea that obviously you have all the different theatres and the different stages and things at BET, and the perception that people have then of what is allocated to different areas. You know, that's almost like BET saying this is what we think is most important, is what's going to appear here, and that sort of thing. And actually, when you've got all these conflicting priorities, what you should have in certain areas, how do you decide what one thing is more important than another? And you also get a perspective as well from the supplier's point of view, I think, because obviously BET's an event where you have so many suppliers come along, so many companies really wanting to talk to schools. The schools have got the challenges, the suppliers have got the challenges as well at the moment, in that, you know, obviously schools being in really sort of, you know, stretched financial situations. So it's a very different landscape from a number of years ago. So it's almost like not exactly having to educate the suppliers about what school priorities are now, but, you know, being conscious of evolving how you do things. We've talked, haven't we, previously about things like extending trials for products, so that if someone comes to BET, sees something that they like, want to try it out, actually giving them a chance to do that for a meaningful period of time, so that they can see the impact that it has. The other thing is that this idea about if you come to BET as a teacher, you don't necessarily know. You know, you won't necessarily come in with a really clear picture of what you're looking for. And I think one of the most intimidating things about BET is if you just arrive and go, I'm just going to walk around. I'm just going to walk around. And you walk into those halls, and of course it's all the halls now. And actually you can end up with, I think, BET fatigue really quickly, because there's just so much to take in. So things like the trails that have been introduced. So actually you can come to BET, you can select what you're there specifically to see, and then you can follow a trail around the show. So you go and see some of the key things. So for example, this year there's going to be a sustainability trail. So you can actually go around and you can talk to suppliers where that they're sort of, you know, really saying, we're really good at doing this. We're really all about sustainable tech. So you don't just have to try and go and find them yourself. So again, it's giving visitors a different experience, but also asking companies, I think, to present themselves in a different way as well, and having to sort of, you know, be aware that this is a really evolving picture all the time, and you can't just stay doing things how you maybe did 5 years ago, and certainly not how we used to do things before the pandemic anyway.
That's really interesting, you know, because essentially it's exactly what we do with the lesson. You know, it's that whole process of trying to provide, you know, an individualized or personalized experience for different sorts of people, in a way that is going to make it accessible for them, meaningful for them. It's almost kind of like finding out what's their why.
Yes, I see what you did there. That was that was seamless, absolutely seamless.
Yeah. So, I mean, that kind of takes me on to, obviously, the focus of the book, what's their why, and you can scan the QR code in the corner there if you're watching. Just get yourself a copy. Comes highly recommended by Emma.
I do. I have my copy here. I actually have my copy here. It's slightly weird, but I do have it here.
There you go. But that exploration about motivation and engagement, that was the journey I was really keen to explore when I was writing the book. And somebody asked me the other day, how did you go about writing it? And basically, it was in the car. I spend an awful lot of time sitting around waiting for my daughter to finish work at silly.
Not driving, not while you were driving. Then
not driving, no. Although voice notes is fantastic.
Yeah.
But no, I spend a lot of time in car parks where my daughter says, "Oh, I'm finishing at 11:30, Dad. Can you pick me up?" And at 12:15, I'm still sitting there. Yeah. So I do a lot of work on my phone through Google Docs and things like that, and just, you know, thoughts as you're sat there in a car park on your own at that time of night. just come to you and you just start to write them down and away they go. But I really wanted to explore that motivation and the engagement side of it, and talking about the way suppliers consider bet and things like that really kind of resonated, because for me, I was on a podcast with Alfonso Mendoza a few days ago, and we were talking about my educational background, and I thought I was a well-motivated student. What it turned out was, looking back on it in hindsight, I was a student who responded well to certain motivations. And at the time, I had no idea, and it's probably taken me about 30 odd years to realize that. I think that certain things do motivate me and others don't at all. And that got me thinking and reflecting back on my own teaching and everything else, and what works and what didn't. And when I speak to former students, I see a lot of former students, because I still live and work and play hockey in the town where I did most of my teaching. And I'm still really good friends with a lot of my former colleagues and former students. A lot of them will talk about lessons and say, oh, do you remember when we did this? And do you remember when we did that? And it was hardly ever about learning. It was always about an experience. It was something that we'd done in the lesson that was memorable, either because it went well or because it didn't quite often, or because it was hilarious, or the way that somebody reacted to it was just brilliant and memorable. And that got me thinking a lot about actually what triggers memory in us as individuals, and how that factors into learning. Because very unfortunately, my mother-in-law passed away a few years back from early onset dementia. But one of the things we noticed with her was that music and film was the one thing that she would still engage with, even though she'd gone past the point of really being able to hold a conversation or anything like that. And she pretty much couldn't really do very much for herself at all. Music and film would evoke a reaction in her, whether it was just a smile or a laugh or a tear because it was sad or whatever. And that really got me thinking about sort of retention. We talk a lot about retention and retrieval in education, particularly at the moment. And I was looking back at my time in education and thinking about, I left school the year Ofsted started. It wasn't related. It wasn't like, he's gone, now get in there. So I left school the year Ofsted started, and I honestly don't remember at any point in my school life feeling like anyone was being watched, anyone was being pressured, anybody was kind of doing anything other than just turning up and teaching us because they enjoyed teaching us. And I might be wrong. I might have just been completely blinkered. But sometimes I look now, and you talked earlier about, the pressures that schools are under, and it's phenomenal. And how much do you think those pressures, for want of a better word, block all of the positive, or block the positives that can come out of those enjoyable, fun, memorable, off the cuff kind of moments that can have such an impact on learning?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I think my answer to that would be I think it depends a lot on the school, because I think that if you are, and I'll talk very much from like my own, the school I know best of all, which is Denby, obviously. In a school like this, where there's been a number of things that we've developed over a number of years, when there's these, and it's an outstanding school, when there are new pressures, when there are shifting competing priorities, you've got a staff body that are better developed to cope with it and to shift accordingly. So the example I would give, for example, is when we talk about things like using technology across the curriculum. I would expect to be able to go into any lesson at Denby, talk to any member of teaching staff, support staff, and they'll confidently be able to tell me how they use technology, how it suits them, how it adapts to what they do, provide me with evidence of impact, all those sorts of things. But the challenge is that if you're in a school where that's not the case, and suddenly you produce technology. So, say for example, the pressure was technology. Suddenly we turn around and said, right, you've got to start using these devices or something like that. I know that's not what we're talking about, but if that was the case, that would be a school that would not be in a position to be able to adapt and cope with it in such a strong way. And I think that often it hits the schools the hardest that are least well placed to cope with this. And I think we know that from things like the EdTech Demonstrator Programme. You know, when you had the chance to go and work with schools that were just starting out on a particular journey, us talking to them about digital strategy, developing digital competency, all those things becomes one other thing they've got to deal with alongside with improving teaching and learning, preparing for the next Ofsted inspection. Now, you know, don't get me wrong, we're due an Ofsted inspection. It's something we're very, very conscious of. It's something that staff are very aware of and have on the radar. But because the school's at the point that it is, we're able to sort of incorporate that as one of another pressure. You know, it doesn't become the defining thing. It doesn't stop us from doing other things. Whereas I think when you're in a school where you do have so many pressures on you all at the same time, some of the things that are the nice to haves don't happen. And you were talking about your early education. I think back to mine, and actually I was one of these students where I was not very good at maths and science. I do not have a very mathematical brain at all. And I was a very creative learner. My subjects were things like drama, performing arts, those sorts of things, anything where you could actually create something rather than just solve a problem. That's what my strengths were. And I was at a school where there was lots of opportunity to do that. There were lots of extracurricular activities. There were teachers giving up their time to support those sorts of things. And again, I think sometimes those are the things that go when there are these other pressures in a school. You know, when you are having to work towards, you know that you're going to have an inspection, you know that you want the best possible outcome you can, that naturally that becomes the focus for you, doesn't it? That becomes, and if you've been told that you are this type of a school and your teaching is at this kind of a level, the focus becomes improving that, and it doesn't leave room for a lot of other things alongside that, particularly when you throw in, all the other competing priorities we've already talked about, like, recruiting and retaining teachers, and the appeal of a teacher to go to a particular school in a particular area based on the situation that school's in. I mean, I'm afraid that's quite a rambling answer, but like I said, I think it's such a hard question to answer with just like a glib statement, because I think it really is impacted by the school's individual circumstance, the perception of that school, and the other pressures that there are on that particular school.
No, I couldn't agree more. It's interesting you mentioned the sort of the arts and the what some people might consider to be like the add-ons that appear at the end of the school day or at break time and lunchtime, like performances and school shows. And I look back at when I first started teaching, and I was very fortunate that when I started work at my first school, they employed us from the July, so that we could kind of hit the ground running in September. And we had a month in school to kind of get to know everyone, do a bit of sort of shadowing, team teaching, bit of planning, getting to know people, students. One of the things that really blew me away in that first few weeks in the school was the school performance, the school show that they put on, which was phenomenal. It was Grease at the time, so obviously a well-known show, and it was something that the school did every year, regardless. And every year they were absolutely phenomenal performances, and you really saw through those performances students grow in confidence, their ability to articulate themselves, their level of responsibility, their level of organisation improved. But because of the pressures of exams and results and everything else, it was probably about 10 years in, we started to have to say, okay, well, we can't have year 11 in the show because they need to be concentrating on their exams. They need to be going to after school sessions and revision sessions rather than going to rehearsal. And of course, that then raised the very difficult conversation with the performing arts team. Well, you can't expect us to put on amazing performing arts shows if we don't have our best performers, because by nature, the ones that have been doing it the longest tended to be the most confident performers. So then it became a little bit watered down in that they couldn't quite manage as much as they wanted to because they didn't have the numbers and they didn't quite have the depth of talent to be able to do some of the shows that they would have been able to do otherwise. And before, I think it was probably about 3 or 4 years after that, actually, it got to the point where it just wasn't feasible to have a show anymore because they couldn't get enough people to be in it, and the amount of work that was going into it just wasn't worth the outcome for the staff and for the students as much as anything else. And when I say it wasn't worth the outcome, I feel really bad saying it like that, but essentially the amount of effort they were putting in was counterproductive on top of everything else that they were having to do on a daily basis.
Yeah.
Not that the show itself wouldn't have been fantastic, because I'm sure it would have done. I'm sure it would still be. But those are the things, like you say, that tend to get dropped. That get put.
And it's such a shame, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, it's like I know you talked about the record of achievement in the book, and I've got one of those because I'm actually a couple of years older than you, and really? I am, yeah, and I know that you said your age on the podcast the other week, and so that was where I clocked it. But yeah, I was lucky; I was still in school before that kind of came in, and so I was able to do drama all the way through school. And in my record of achievement, it said Emma started at the school really shy, very quiet, but grew in confidence over the time that she was here through taking part in school productions, through taking part in things like I joined. There was a Bedfordshire Youth Theatre that took us on tours around France and Germany. Would probably be a logistical nightmare now with health and safety and everything else. But we went on these like fantastic tours around schools in other countries and things. And that was what grew me in confidence. That was what, if I had to pinpoint the one thing that made a difference in terms of how I was when I first came to that upper school and how I was when I left at the end of the sixth form, it was having those opportunities and those like presenting opportunities and those public speaking opportunities that made the difference. When I then went on to, I don't think for 1 minute I would have got into the university I did and gone and done the course I did if I hadn't had those chances at school. And like you say, it is such a shame when students don't get that. And I mean, one of the things we did here at Denby when we had obviously the pandemic and school shows had to stop and we couldn't do any of that, we did a virtual green screen production. We did 2 full green screen productions because we wanted to still have students able to take part in that, able to have that experience, but we had to incorporate into it social distancing. So we did a production of Aladdin, and you'll see that in Aladdin the carpet is flying through the air and Aladdin and Princess Jasmine are 2 meters apart on the carpet because we wanted to have that scene, and but we still had to stick with the guidelines. Yeah, it was a big carpet, and all the scenes were filmed separately, and some of them were like overlaid. So you had actors who literally weren't talking face to face, but we brought together so that the students would still get that experience of participating in a school production, because they weren't going to get it otherwise, because we just couldn't simply do it during the pandemic and during those conditions that we had. But it was one of those things that, again, here we felt was so important, because that is what develops the confidence. And if you've got that child that sat there in a lesson and is not the child putting their hand up, what are you going to do to improve that? What are you going to do to change that? And it was just one of the things that we found we could do. We could use technology to support, to kind of keep that element of school life and that element of community going as well.
Interesting. You talk about that kind of that engagement side of things, and how do you bring the most out of those quiet students? I was reflecting a couple of days ago on sort of past parents' evenings, and the kinds of things that as teachers we say, and then we instantly regret it, or we kind of go, why did I say that? Like the classics, like, what did you just say? Well, you really don't want them to repeat it, but you've just literally opened the door and said go for it, because we just can't stop ourselves. And one of the things that kind of came to my mind at that point was being at parents' evenings and saying it myself and hearing other teachers saying exactly the same thing, or they're a quiet student, they need to put their hand up more and answer more. Thinking that was going to make a difference. Us just saying put your hand up more was suddenly going to change their habit.
You could just magically instill confidence, and it would just
and I think there was a really there's a podcast I was listening to a couple of weeks ago with Abdul Johan and Dylan William, and they were talking about teacher development amongst other things. And one of the things that they talked about was the difference between sort of changing knowledge and changing habits. And quite often what we try and do with people is change knowledge, or assume that they don't have the knowledge. So we teach grandmother to suck eggs. We might say to people, right, we're not marking well enough, so let's all have an hours long CPD on how to mark. We're not going to do any marking during that CPD. We're going to talk to you about how to mark. and it's going to be really dry and really dull, and you're probably all going to be wishing you were doing something else or answering your emails, because we've all been there and we've all done it. But actually, it being about, it's not the knowledge that's lacking. We all know how to get the best out of our students, out of ourselves. We've got the knowledge. We know what we need to do. It's the habits that we don't have.
Yeah.
And how that by bolting a new habit onto an existing one can be a really positive way of moving things forward. So in the podcast, Dylan William was talking about, having one thing that you do every day and then just bolting that on. And then it was interesting because I was watching a TV program, Stephen Merchant was on, and he was saying exactly the same thing, that he gets up in the morning, the first thing he does is he makes himself a cup of coffee. And while he's making his cup of coffee, he has a 5-minute kind of high impact intensity strengthening workout in the kitchen while the kettle's boiling, because he knows if he leaves the kitchen and goes to do something else, he'll get sidetracked and he won't do that stretch. Whereas if he stays there and does it while the kettle's boiling, it's probably going to be a consistent amount of time every time. There's no way he's not going to have his coffee, so he's always going to do that stretch. And within a few weeks, that had become the habit rather than the bolt-on. And a couple of occasions, he started doing his strength exercises without even putting the kettle on, and then realised afterwards. And it got me thinking about how we as teachers, how we suddenly expect people to change how they're doing things because we're giving them a bit of feedback without giving them any tools to help them achieve that, and how we can do it. So, when we're giving people feedback saying, oh, you should do this, whether it's a student or a teacher, how are we suggesting they go about doing it? And I don't think we do enough of that.
No, and I think you said in the book, because one of the things you talked about was this idea about the coaching for students, and that's something that we introduced a couple of years ago here. We do something called assertive mentoring. So when we have students in year 11, and we'd love to be able to do it with all students, but we just don't have enough mentors to be able to do it. But we've got a range of staff who act as mentors. So when these students come into year 11, and as they progress through the year, they will have like weekly meetings with these members of staff who will not be, talking to them about necessarily how they're doing in lessons or about their behaviour or sticking their hand up over the ears, but we'll be talking to them about the wider issues, what they're worried about. And I mean, they're not designed to be counsellors. That's a completely different thing. But when you talk about like changing habits, and how, again, as teachers, you're trying to change habits, you've got a class of 30 kids. And you've got to try and change the habit of a couple of students, and you haven't got the time and all that sort of thing. The assertive mentoring kind of addresses that, almost in terms of trying to unpick what the student's struggling with and why, and then helping them develop strategies. Because you're giving the example of someone who, in terms of like exercising in the kitchen, was self-motivated to do that, was something that they wanted to introduce. Our biggest issue is when you've got students who are going, well, I don't want to do that. Why should I? Or what's the point? Or what, So it's actually giving them that one-to-one time to actually help them develop those practices and those different ways of doing it. And like you say, that repetition, by that seeing that same person every week and going over it over and over again and saying, actually, how are you getting on with that? If it didn't work, why didn't it work? Well, let's talk a bit more widely about that. And we found that's been really, really beneficial for those students that are involved in that. And we've seen a real impact on the results that they then achieve, because obviously year 11 is such high pressure anyway, but the results that they achieve at the end of the year, because they've had that intervention. And we do all the things that other schools will do, where there'll be booster sessions and after school clubs and all these sorts of things. But in terms of like a real personalized intervention strategy, that assertive mentoring has made a massive difference. And that's something that we've carried on year, because I think you're exactly right. It's that helping younger people to change their habits, to change how they're learning, to change how they do things, to change how they're even viewing the whole topic of exams. What's the point? Why are we doing this? Why should I care? All that sort of stuff, and giving them that personalized attention that we perhaps don't get time to do elsewhere in school.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of what the whole What's Their Why was all about, really, helping young people to work out why it is that they're doing what they're doing. Pupils come to school every day for a reason. It's not because their parents make them, even though that might be what they say. It's not because we'll get fined otherwise. That's not the motivation, because if that was the motivation, they'd find other things to do, and they'd find ways around it. They come to school for a reason, and too many, I think, don't get the opportunity to properly explore what that is.
Yeah.
And not because they don't have the opportunity to, but maybe they don't see the opportunities, or they don't recognize them as opportunities, or they don't have anybody to kind of point those opportunities out to them and say, well, you really enjoy doing this. And, those really able students who get in loads of trouble when they're in the younger year groups, because they're always asking questions and they're always challenging teachers' answers, and they get themselves told off all the time, and then everybody else copies them. Well, leadership, fantastic. How do we pivot that to make it a positive thing? And that's...
Sorry about my half-past bell.
That's all right. It's half past, is it? There you go. Little time check for everybody.
In school, you can tell.
Absolutely. But it's that kind of the ability to be able to look at what is your motivation, and then to be able to plot a path as to, so what is that going to provide you later on? Because the kind of the question that I was always asked at school is, what do you want to do when you leave school? And my answer was, I don't know. I want to go to sixth form. Why did I want to go to sixth form? Because most other people went to sixth form. I didn't have a reason for going to sixth form. It was because that's what pretty much happened. Why did I go to university? Because a lot of my friends were going to university. That got talked about a lot. None of my family had ever been to university, but it sounded like the thing you do when you finished A-levels if you don't know what you want to do.
Yeah.
And I didn't know what I wanted to do. And even probably until my last year at uni, I had no idea exactly what I was going to do when I finished uni. And then I kind of decided that teaching was the way forward. And, thousands of students later, they're all regretting it. But there was no kind of, careers guidance, those mentorships that you're talking about there. Those are the prime opportunities to have those kind of conversations.
And I think they're even more important now, because you can't, with the jobs market how it is, with the fact that we're always, this responsibility of schools that we're supposed to be preparing these young people for these future jobs, with this acknowledgement that we don't know necessarily what those jobs are even going to look like. The ways that which we prepared for careers and we prepared for those progression routes are not necessarily going to be the right ones for our young people. And just because we did it, and I think it's that kind of acknowledgement of actually empowering them to understand just intrinsically what motivates them, so that they can actually, because they will have, I've had like a massive sort of career wiggle over the years. I haven't had a career path. It's gone all over the place. That new opportunities have come up, roles have been created that I'd never even thought of, and I've gone in that sort of direction. And it's this thing about, they'll probably have lots of different jobs. They'll probably try things out that they don't like. They'll probably need to go on to something else, but they'll need that resilience and that level of self-awareness to turn around and go, okay, yeah, so I've learned that from that job, and now I'm gonna go into this, because and also having the personal strength to say, you know what, I did that and I didn't like it. I went down that route and I thought that was what I wanted to do, and it wasn't right for me at all. And when I left university, I thought I wanted to work in like the theatre, and I actually did go and work, not as an actor or anything, but work in sort of production in the theatre. And I went and actually did that for a while, and I was like, yeah, this isn't for me at all. This is not right for me. And it was that kind of then going, okay, so in terms of what I have learned, the skills I have got, what am I going to go on to do? And I can honestly say there isn't a single job I've done where I haven't learned something. I haven't gained some kind of knowledge and experience that I still use now, and that still comes in incredibly, incredibly useful now. And I think that it is that kind of moving away from thinking we've got to be teaching these children that they've got to follow this path. This is the progression route. This is what we're most comfortable with. So this is what it's always going to be. It's not like that anymore. That's not the route they're going to have. It's a different set of skills, isn't it?
Absolutely. And the intrinsic motivators you talked about, and I mentioned it in the book as well, and the difference between the intrinsic and the extrinsic. Yeah. A lot of people won't even kind of, for want of a better word, won't even kind of acknowledge that there's a difference between the two, because they just don't have time in the business of the day with everything else going on. They see motivators, whether it's, getting your pay packet at the end of the month, pay packet, how old am I? Blimey. or whether it's getting a certificate, whether it's getting a pat on the back from the boss, or whether it's getting a phone call home to your parents, those extrinsic motivators might work some of the time, but as soon as they disappear, what then motivates you, and it's the intrinsic stuff that I think is really important, and setting yourself your own little goals and recognizing actually what sort of things you enjoy within yourself.
Yeah. And what does motivate you? Gave the example of that page, didn't you? And writing hundreds and hundreds of words on a page for a teacher just to get a reaction, because any reaction was going to be a good reaction. And that, that acknowledgement of that understanding and unpicking yourself and your own psyche almost, and saying, yeah, that actually, I got a kick out of that. I enjoyed that. And that's why I wanted to do it.
But that's taken me nearly 40 years to recognise.
Well, it's better late than never, isn't it? I mean,
well, absolutely, yeah. Well, hopefully, at some point, he'll mark it and I'll get some feedback. Until then, I'm not redoing it. He can whistle for it. But it is that kind of those setting those goals for yourself. It's sometimes, you know, very, very difficult to do when you are in a position where you don't necessarily know where you want to go, and there's loads of talk at the moment about the quiet quitting and people leaving various professions in droves because of the situations that they're in. But it's that kind of, what's going to motivate you to keep you there, or what motivates you to make that move? Like you said, I've been in a similar position. I moved into a headship, which was the worst decision I've ever made for myself. Why did I make that decision? To accept the position? Probably because I felt it was expected of me.
Yeah.
Because it was a natural progression, and there was this linear approach to progression in schools that didn't
and there is teaching that you're gonna
but in hindsight, I learned a huge amount from that experience, like you say, and I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now had I not gone through that experience. Because it wouldn't have forced that change in me. It wouldn't have forced me to take a look and go, okay, so what do I want to get out of life? Because this definitely isn't it. And I think that's that's one of the real things I think students miss out on massively now. Not everyone, but work experience kind of in a lot of places just fell by the wayside in recent years because of, you know, myths around health and safety, and they can't do this and they can't do that, but also because a lot of small businesses just didn't have the capacity to take somebody on and look after them for 3 weeks, because that took capacity away from the business itself. But that experience of being able to try things out, and even if you find you absolutely hate it, that's still being a valuable learning opportunity.
Yeah, it's not a failure, is it? It's this redefining what constitutes a failure or an unsuccessful experience or something. If it's an experience, there's something you will have got a value from it. Even if you've hated it, even if you've absolutely hated it, there'll be something that you can extract from that. But you've got to develop those analytical skills, don't you, in terms of being able to reflect on what you've done. And also, it's always the irony that obviously some of that you can only build up that experience over time. You know, you have to get to around about our age to, you know, have that kind of bank of experience that you can look back on and see that career path and see how that went through. And I think we need to get a lot better at that with young people. And actually, like you say, I think we have kind of narrowed in some ways some of the experiences they do get through necessity. I think the last 3 years has narrowed the experiences that they've had, but that we ought to be looking now and saying, right, well, how can we broaden that again? How can we, you know, expand that back out for them?
Yeah, no, completely. And, you know, and those final assessments, for want of a better word, exams, if you want to call it that, as a prime example. You know, we've gone through a period where the classic exam system as we recognize it was different for best part of 3 years, and we're now heading back to a situation where it's probably going to go back to exactly what it was prior to that COVID situation.
Yeah, which to me seems crazy, because I think, you know, if I look at, we had an ECT conference last year, and one of the things that I talked about that was when I look back on how things used to happen in my school life compared to how it happens now for sort of, you know, someone in year 10 or 11, absolutely everything is different, with the exception of exams. Those students will still go in and sit at a little desk. The paper will be put in front of them exactly the same way as it was for me. And it's that, is this really still the best way to do things? You know, is this really still the best way to assess a young person's competencies and capabilities and make a judgment on them in that way? You know, where and I know we're moving towards things, and I know things are happening behind the scenes, but I find it quite amazing that we are still that number of years down the line doing things in exactly the same way.
And, you know, prime example, you know, we consider it to be, you know, almost like sector leading to say if a student's got particular learning difficulty, well, we'll give them 25% extra time then. Like that's going to make an amazing. No, don't give them 25% extra time. Give them a different way of doing it altogether. That's going to work for them. Like we've all been in situations where we've had conversation with adults and young people who are brilliantly able to articulate themselves, but if you ask them to put it down on paper, you've got no chance whatsoever. It will just be either nothing will appear because they hate the blank page, or what it does appear will probably be a bit of a mess because they'll talk themselves out of it and they'll convince themselves they're wrong because they'll start self-editing, or you know they'll end up, you know, just kind of writing what they think is the right thing to write without really thinking about what their own thoughts are. And I think particularly, I mean, there's obviously a huge amount of talk, particularly online at the moment, and through the media as well, about AI and chatbots and all these kind of things. But, you know, we really do need to take the opportunity to look at the nature of assessment and how that can better display the abilities of the young people. Because coming back to the point you made about work experience and employment and everything else and careers, you know, we've got companies who are saying pupils aren't coming through showing us the right skills, the skills we want. We're sending students out into the world with a set of skills that maybe aren't relevant to the roles that they're going into. There's not a lot of crossover between the two. There's not enough of, as an education world, us saying to the employers, well, tell us what skills you want. And we'll make sure we'll develop them, because that doesn't fit with the system that we've got in place. And it's scary and it's new and it's different. So I do think we need to massively kind of, for want of a better word, kind of uproot assessment and just provide, you know, I'm not against exams at all.
No, I'm not. I think for the right things, I think that they're, you know, and being able to sort of cope with stress and pressure and focus your thinking and everything, I don't have an issue with that, you know, at all. But also as someone who, when they were doing their own GCSEs, had a chance to like sort of demonstrate other skills through things like, you know, performances and assessments and different ways of, you know, and films. I mean, crikey, that was cutting edge at the time, you know, creating a film and submitting it as part of your coursework, you know. It's just giving them the way to demonstrate the breadth of skills, isn't it? And not just pigeonhole that if you don't work particularly well in this situation, well, then that's going to make it clear where you stand. That's going to affect the rest of your career.
And that's the other thing as well. You know, you look, when we talk about careers and lifelong learners, you know, we talk a lot about that to pupils. But in our own careers, I mean, I cannot tell you the last time I sat any kind of test or exam that wasn't open book or alternative to the traditional in some way, shape or form. So probably since university, I've not had to sit an exam in the traditional sense of the world. So they're not really even relevant to 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago in a lot of situations. And I think it's a real shame that we haven't moved further forward quicker. Like you say, there are conversations going on and there are pilots and trials going on, and fingers crossed that will develop into a landscape that's much more inclusive for people. Because
and I hope as well, I hope that things like this sort of, you know, chat GPTs have the conversations that are, because I think sometimes in schools we're a little bit guilty, or in some schools, of behaving a bit like we're in a castle, and if there's something outside we don't like, we can just bring up the drawbridge and that's it, it's not getting in, you know, that's it, we've decided we don't agree with this, we don't accept this, it's not right, it's not coming in. Whereas I think so many of the things now, it's not about that as a mentality, it's already here, it's already being used, you know. If we as like sort of staff in schools are aware of this, you know full well the students are aware of it and are already checking it out at home and are seeing how it can work for them. And I think sometimes you need these big disruptors to actually, you know, elicit that change, don't you? And I mean, the pandemic I would have hoped, if one good thing had come out of it, that would have transformed to an extent the way that we deliver teaching and learning, and the way that we engage with online learning and education technology and things. That hasn't happened, I think, we probably both agree, in like the ideal way that we would like to have seen. But maybe it's going to take something else, like this rapid expansion of AI, to really force the hand almost in saying, would you know what, we have got to, because what's going to be the alternative? We're going to say, no, everything is being done on paper in school with someone looking over your shoulder to make sure you're not using AI to give you that. Is that really what we're going to do? And then send these children out into the world of work where they are going to be using these same tools to work smarter, faster, more efficiently. You know, I'd like to think that's not what we're going to do.
No, far better to say to those same students, go away and produce a podcast.
Yeah.
Where you explain your understanding of this concept.
Yeah. Or I'm going to expect you to have produced far more content in the time because you've got these other tools that allow you to do things faster and quicker. But I'm going to expect to see your own incisive analysis on this, about how you've adapted it and changed it to reflect your own thinking, because you're going to be quizzed in depth about your own thinking about this topic. And you can't just regurgitate what someone else has told you to write.
Exactly, because I was talking to Louise Jones earlier on today. We were on a call together, and we were talking about, you know, AI CV writers and job application letter writers, and just imagining people going in and sitting down at interview and being kind of like, so you mentioned in your letter, did I?
Yeah.
Really?
But I thought it was really interesting as well. I mean, when this whole conversation started about AI and everything, is that the immediate reaction was, oh my gosh, they're talking about the students and cheating. That was the immediate thing. And then almost like what's coming around the periphery, and you're seeing much more of is groups of teachers and groups of staff in school going, but hang on a minute, actually this could help reduce workload. Actually, this could help improve well-being, you know, and there needs to be that sort of sensitivity in discussing it and looking at all the different elements of it, and not just jumping straight to the panic button and the, you know, bringing up the drawbridge of, oh my gosh, the students are going to use it to cheat. You know, it's let's be a bit more mature about it. Let's look more widely than that. Let's look at and there's some really good pieces coming out, and I think where you have got lots of different people writing about it, talking about it, discussing the possibilities, almost saying the things that we need to be thinking about, the things we need to be maturely considering about this, because it's not just going to suddenly go away.
No, and it's been around for years.
Yeah.
You know, cookies on a website, understanding, you know, whether or not you've been searching for something and chucking up your adverts on Facebook, and giving it away because you hadn't used an incognito window, that you've booked a holiday to Mallorca and your wife's found out about it because of all these sudden ads or whatever. That's been happening for ages.
Yeah, even if you're using things like digital documents, if you're getting students to submit homework on a Google Doc and all of a sudden this huge chunk of text just appears on their essay from nowhere when you look at like the version history, that's a red flag, isn't it? You know, but I think again, it comes back to that level of confidence that teachers already have, depending on the tools that they are already using.
Absolutely. Hopefully it will please you to know that I've now got this mental image of you as well, with a kind of like a rounded helmet looking over the top of the castle down at the rest of the Monty Python crew. Just defending your castle from the big wooden rabbit that's got AI tucked inside it. What a great image that is. Talking about having a laugh and all that kind of thing. We obviously had a chat over Twitter a few months back, and it kind of led me to the next question, really.
I'm a little bit nervous now.
Well, some people you are aware, but other people may not be, that in the summer I took up fishing, because it's something I've wanted to do for probably 40 years, but never thought I could manage sitting by the side of a lake and doing nothing all day, because of the way my brain works. And my God, how wrong I was. It's so great. Just reconnecting with nature and that digital detox, but also just doing something on a completely different level of speed. So that got us to talking about clickbait.
Yes.
which at one point was going to be the title of a podcast.
It would have been the podcast, yeah.
But actually, it's now just a section. So we've got it in there somewhere. So what do you do to take a break, to get away from the from all the
to have
press.
that digital detox, to have that.
Yeah.
I probably do two main things, to be honest, because I mean, I don't know about you, I find that during the week I'm online a lot, I'm working on a lot of different devices, I'm regularly scrabbling under desks for cables, shoving things in, that sort of thing. So on a Saturday morning, one of the things that I do to unwind is I do an hour and a half yoga. It's an online yoga class, and I first started doing this was pre-pandemic. I was going down to a little church hall and sort of taking part in this class. And a bit like you, I never thought, I was a bit like, is this something I'm going to like? Is this gonna... And I've absolutely loved it, because like you, this hour and a half of, for starters, getting yourself in a mental headspace where whatever's happened during the week, you just park and you just leave, and it gets you to focus sort of completely differently. Also stretches you out really well, which if you come to the end of the week and you're a bit hunched over from all your tapping on keyboards and things, it's really, really good for you in that respect. And when we went into the pandemic, the teacher just moved the class online, and that's even better, because now instead of having to get into a car and drive down the road to go to somewhere, I literally do this in my lounge, so no one can see me, no one can see how ridiculous I look, and it is such a lovely start to the weekend, and it's one of those things that I found has been brilliant for like my mental well-being, my physical well-being. I've got like a thyroid problem, so whereas I would love to be like a long distance runner or do like bike riding or like Ironman or something like that, that's never going to happen with me. But like this kind of like lower impact exercise is brilliant. So I do the yoga. The other thing is gardening, and I think that's what's got more in common with your fishing actually, is just I love whatever else is going on in the world, all the things that are out of my control. The one thing you can rely on is if you go in the garden and you plant something and you halfway know what you're doing, it's going to grow, and I really like that. I like being able to like switch off completely, go out there, create something. We take part in open gardens every year, so I open up my garden to people. It's not that impressive, to be honest, but I sort of do it anyway. And that's something again, as far as like, I think we've become much better over the last few years about talking about things like mindful activities and things that are really good for your mental health. So yeah, gardening and yoga definitely would be my two top tips for like mindful activities. Monty Don, Gardener's World, that man is my absolute hero, apart from you obviously, Darren. He is someone that I have learned so much from, and no, I really do find that then means after a weekend of gardening and yoga, I can come back into work on Monday and I'm ready to sort of get back on the tech again and pick up where I left off.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because both of those and the fishing for myself as well, that they involve something which is a complete switch off.
Yeah.
Albeit that you're doing yours sort of remotely, but a lot of it is around self-care.
Yeah.
And I don't like to use the terms mindfulness and self-care too much, because sometimes, particularly in schools, that can feel a little bit forced. So it's 3:15 on Friday. You are all coming to have a cup of tea and a cake.
Yeah.
It could be a little bit, well, hold on a minute, that's not helping my mindfulness, because I'd rather be going home and getting down the pub. But that level of patience, I think, is really important. And I think that's probably the one thing that society now, particularly for our younger people, doesn't do a particularly good job of, is giving the opportunity to develop patience.
Yeah.
Because I think it is a skill. It is something that you can hone. But because everything is available at the touch of a button, and not necessarily because of technology, but through other means as well, everything is so much more connectable, so much more reachable. Everything is so much more immediate. The need for that element of patience and just being able to wait, knowing that it is going to happen.
Yeah.
That plant is going to grow. That fish is in the pond. It might well be swimming around looking at you and then laughing and swimming off again, but it is in there. And it's just a question of patience and trying different techniques to get the most out of that situation. And I think that's one of the things that particularly in schools, we could do a lot more with. And
I think it's interesting what you said about doing the fishing, because it's when you're in schools, when you do the sort of jobs that we do, I think you're around people and you enjoy that and you love being around people. And I love the sort of, the fast paced nature, how quickly things get done. It's really refreshing. It's busy. It's always, there's always lots going on. but then to have these activities that actually in some ways are quite solitary activities and do give you, it's okay to not be doing too much. Whereas normally you look at an hour and like, so I'm gonna get this done, this done, this and this done, to go, do you know, no, I'm just gonna have an hour. And I'm just going to do something very calm and very slow, and I'm not going to see an immediate result, and that is okay, because that's where the light and shade is with my week. There is where the difference comes in, because I don't want to be that person that works at that pace 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. I couldn't be that person. I wouldn't be able to do that. So I think there's a lot to be said for those sorts of activities that do give you a bit of your own headspace to just slow down a bit, because that's something that I don't think we do enough of.
No, and I think, you know, within lessons, we're often so not sidetracked, I suppose, but we're so kind of in the back of our mind, we're thinking pace, we're thinking we've got to move things along. Actually, the time taken to kind of take a little bit of extra time to investigate something, to deliberately do something wrong and see what happens. I think sometimes that get lost in the overall race to cover all the curriculum content and everything else. And I do think that's a real shame. And it's one of those things that I think schools that have got school gardens or you know, school pets, I just think absolutely superb, because there is no better way of seeing what nurturing and patience and providing the right circumstances can do for the animals. And that brings forward in the students such a sense of empathy that I think otherwise they don't get. And I think, you know, having worked in a school that was special measures at one stage, and we introduced we got some rehomed battery hens, and probably what people might have classed as one of the most difficult classes were in charge of looking after them. And the change I saw in those kids who were literally like couldn't care less about anybody else, but suddenly can we go out and can we go and muck the chickens out because they need cleaning, and we need to collect their eggs, and they need some fresh bedding for the weekend, and while we're out there, can we check to see how the potatoes are doing, because they had a potato growing race. Everyone had a sack, everyone put potato in, and then at the end of it they had to weigh who earned the most, and they got so competitive, you know. But the change that we saw in those kids and the change in the behavior as a result, because of that empathy, was fantastic. And I do think, you know, we talk a lot about pace and progress and moving forward. That doesn't need to be at the cost of everything that's that little bit slower, a little bit more deliberate, and just as valuable, I think.
Yeah, and it shouldn't be. Definitely.
No. Well, Emma, it's been great chatting. It's been almost an hour, and it doesn't feel like it at all. I could literally talk to you for another 2 or 3 minutes easily. But we're going to call it a close there, because you've probably got lunch to go and have and things like that. But thanks ever so much for joining me. I look forward to catching up with you again soon.
No, it's been great. Thank you ever so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
It's an absolute pleasure. And thanks to everybody for watching or listening, whichever it is you've chosen to do. If you're watching, I apologise for the state of me. If you're listening, I apologise for the voice. But that's all I'm apologising for. And don't forget, buy the book. What's Their Why? It's on Amazon.